In the beginning, man believed flight to be the privilege of mythological gods. The gods of Crete, of Egypt, of Assyria, and of Greece. As man's capabilities developed, so developed his power to dream of his own ability to fly. Leonardo da Vinci, whose genius stands in marked contrast to the ideas of his contemporaries. If it were not for the dreams in his fertile mind and the dreams in the minds of generations that followed, there would have been no tomorrow. Throughout history, throughout the world, the achievement of sustained, controlled, and powered flight eluded man. The dream was there, but never fulfilled. Sir George Cayley, with his revolutionary wing designs, solved the problems of lift. Steam and clockwork planes followed in 1857. Mosaiski's 1884 steam plane almost succeeded. Then, in 1903, the Wright brothers flew and created fresh dreams in the minds of the young. December 1988. A test pilot makes a final systems check before the first flight of the world's most advanced combat aircraft. But this aeroplane is not a product of the superpowers or European conglomerates. It was produced by a country of only 5 million people, a country that has remained at peace in a century devastated by war, a country with one of the most advanced aircraft industries in the world, Sweden. Today, Sweden's position as a leading aircraft producer is secure, but it could so easily have been very different. If it wasn't for the determination of the Swedish people to remain neutral and the dream in the hearts of aviation pioneers down the years, there would be no story to tell. It all started 80 years ago with one man, Baron Cederström. Carl Gustaf Cederström was born in Stockholm in 1867 of aristocratic parents. After a brief career in the Navy and a failed farming venture in the USA, he arrived in Paris a bankrupt, surviving only by singing in bars. After 10 years, he returned to the family fold, and in 1907, he set up Sweden's first automobile factory. But his growing fascination with flight led him back to Paris, and in 1910, he became the first Swede to hold a pilot's license. Later the same year, he returned to Stockholm and built his first aircraft. It was to launch the Swedish nation into the age of flight. After making some modifications in his car factory, the Baron took off on his first long-distance flight from Copenhagen to Malmö. The extent of the Baron's risk on this long flight can be judged by a newspaper report of the time. We were surprised to learn that Baron Cederström's flying experience consists of only a few hours' instruction at the Blériot School. The fields around Paris are very different to our situation here. No one can quite believe that this flimsy machine will ever get into the air, let alone stay there. All our hearts and prayers go with him, but many doubt if he'll ever be seen again. At Malmö, the Baron's destination, a large crowd gathered. After several hours, the Baron's aircraft appeared through the mist. Following several abortive attempts, the Baron made a bumpy but safe landing. But this wasn't the end of his achievement. During his flight, he had reached a height of 740 meters, a new world altitude record. Despite suffering from frostbite and exposure, the Baron was only too pleased to recount his story to the curious onlookers. As well as his wife and family, who had been too nervous to watch his landing, Baron Cederström was greeted by many of the Swedish aristocracy, including King Gustav, who was captivated by the Baron's first flight and gave him every encouragement. Cederström was soon joined by other aviation pioneers. Born in Denmark, Carl Svensson had been building model gliders since he was a boy. In 1910, he designed and built his first powered box kite aircraft. After a tour of Norway, he arrived in Stockholm, where he met Baron Cederström. Early in 1911, he and the Baron, who had become firm friends, took off. Circling Stockholm, they became the first pilots to fly together in Swedish skies. But the price for the pioneers was heavy. By 1918, Svensson had been badly injured, and the Baron killed while opening up a new route from Stockholm to Finland. From the beginning, the Swedish military have always played a major role in the development of aviation. In 1911, the Royal Swedish Navy received its first machine, a license-built Blériot 12. Piloted by Navy Lieutenant Olof Dahlbeck, who had gained his pilot's license in England, the Blériot 12, or Big Bat as it was known, served for 5 years, writing the first chapter in the Air Force's long history. In the early pioneering days, most of the aircraft flown in Sweden were imported. One man was to change all that and launch Sweden into the field of aircraft production, Enoch Thulin. Born in 1881, Thulin had always been captivated by the ideal of flight. After graduating from university, he spent 3 years studying aeronautics in France. Returning to Stockholm in 1913, he determined to be the first man to fly across the Baltic. Taking off from Landskrona in southern Sweden, in a specially converted floatplane, Thulin flew due south, aiming to reach the German coast at Stralsund near Rostock. But shortly after leaving the Swedish coast, he flew into low cloud. With only a compass which was distorted by the vibration of the engine, Thulin pressed on. A large group of Thulin's family and friends who had traveled ahead to Stralsund waited in the failing light. As the hours passed, the tension mounted. After 3 hours, and much to the relief of his family, Thulin's aircraft broke through the low cloud and made a successful landing. Further flights followed, including a world endurance record of 4 hours, 17 minutes. In September 1913, Thulin founded his own aircraft factory at Landskrona. Initially, the production was only small scale. Specialists from France were brought in to train the Swedish craftsmen in aircraft building techniques. Every process, from building fabric wings to carved wooden propellers, was carried out by hand. Despite its small scale, the Thulin work soon gained a reputation for excellence. The propellers were especially sought after, being some of the finest balanced in Europe. But Thulin's small enterprise was soon to change radically. In 1915, at the height of the First War, the government ordered the establishment of Army and Navy Air Arms. A large order was placed with the Thulin Company. Production was rapidly expanded and modernized. By 1916, more than 1,000 people were employed at the factory. As well as license-built aircraft, many of Thulin's own designs and adaptations were constructed. To test these new designs, he constructed a wind tunnel, one of the first in the world. Not content with aircraft production, Thulin soon started Sweden's first civil pilot school at Ljungbyhed, later to become the Swedish Air Force's main training base. But Thulin's career was to be tragically short. In 1919, 1 month after his marriage, he took off to test one of his new designs. He was never seen again. After his death, the Thulin Company collapsed, due at least in part to the government's decision to import war surplus aircraft from abroad. One of the first was the FVM Phoenix. Originally built in Germany, it served as a basic trainer. Purchased from Britain, the Bristol fighter served alongside the Avro 504 as Sweden's main fighter force of the 1920s. Designed by Claude Dornier, the Friedrichshafen became Sweden's main maritime patrol aircraft. One of the best of the small number of Swedish-designed aircraft was the Tummeliten. Constructed by Porat and Kjelsen from drawings left by Enoch Thulin, the Tummeliten served from 1919 to 1935 as an advanced trainer. In 1921, a new force entered Swedish aviation. Ernst Heinkel had moved to Sweden in 1920 to avoid the Versailles Treaty banning aircraft production in Germany. Heinkel soon set up his own company, Svenska Aero AB. Using mostly German engineers, the company soon found a market building float planes for the Swedish Navy. But the enterprise was shrouded in secrecy. The company was never registered, and no financial records were ever kept. In 1932, the firm went bankrupt, and Heinkel returned home to work in the flourishing German aircraft industry. Despite the suspect nature of his company, Heinkel's aircraft proved to be highly successful. The S-5 flew with the Swedish Air Force for 20 years, from 1928. Amongst its many credits is the daring rescue of the Italian explorer Umberto Nobile from his wrecked airship, and the first kill of the Second War, when, ironically, an S-5 shot down a Heinkel 111. A degree of antagonism and a lack of cooperation had always existed between the Army and Navy air arms. The government recognized the importance of a unified and effective fighting force, and in 1926, the two arms were combined to form the Royal Swedish Air Force. Commanded by General Amundsen, the early Air Force's reviews were not very impressive. A variety of imported and home-built aircraft, some already outdated, and different approaches to training, all led to an inefficient and dangerously weak force. To remedy this, Amundsen instituted a series of grueling training exercises. Even in the extremest of weather conditions, the work to bring men and machine up to standard continued. As well as training, Amundsen began annual inter-squadron competitions. This film, shot in 1927, records one of the first ever held. The SK-1s, or albatrosses, are taking part in an extended relay race held between the frozen lakes of northern Sweden. Because of the ground conditions, both men and machine traveled on skis. As well as keeping up morale, the Games also provided much-needed experience in air-to-ground cooperation, vital in any future conflict. Air defense exercises were also a high priority. This rare footage records one of the first ever to take place between the Army and Air Force. Phoenix aircraft are being used in a simulated attack on the naval base at Stockholm. The methods may look primitive, but the Swedish Air Force had taken a giant step forward in realizing the awesome destructive power of air attacks on undefended cities. By the beginning of the 1930s, the Royal Swedish Air Force had transformed itself from a collection of badly organized wings into one unified body. Service teams were required to strip down, repair, refuel, and rearm aircraft without the aid of workshops or specialized tools. The Air Force prided itself on the fastest turnaround of aircraft in the world, a record which it retains to this day. However, the standard of training was not matched by the quality of aircraft. To remedy their shortfall in training machines, the Air Force imported various types from abroad. The British Tiger Moth became one of the best loved and most durable basic trainers. The Raab Katzenstein 26 was not so successful. Built under license from Germany, it was difficult to fly and cost a number of lives in its 8 years of service. Despite these failures, the small Swedish aviation industry struggled on. Although the Air Force continued to buy foreign aircraft, like this Dutch Fokker CVE, the small company ASJA fought back, and in 1930 it produced the J6. The J6 proved to be a great success, and served as Sweden's frontline fighter defense of the 30s. But events in Europe were about to transform the Swedish Air Force. The rise of Hitler and German rearmament threatened the Swedes' neutral stance. Sweden's geographic position was extremely vulnerable. Germany already controlled the Baltic, Sweden's main trade route, and Russia threatened invasion through Finland. In the autumn of 1936, the government went into a crisis meeting, at the end of which the Prime Minister, Albin Hansson, stated, "As far as possible, our nation should produce its own weapons. Every instance in which we buy from abroad makes us more dependent on other countries." General Olsen explains,
"If you can't defend your air territory, you are very bad off whatever you do with the rest of your defense, because then it will be a question more on when you come down on your knees instead of if you come down on your knees." So I think the Air Force will take a very active part in neutrality defense. And I think this has been aware to our politicians for a very long time. And I think then when they took the decision in 1936 of strengthening the Air Force, I think it was just a very strong awareness from the political side of the importance of the Air Force in a defense aiming for neutrality.
The result of the Swedish government's decision was twofold. Firstly, to institute a large-scale Swedish aircraft industry, and secondly, to double the size of the Air Force. But both policies would take time, and to fill the gap, the Air Force was compelled to import combat machines. The B-4, a license-built version of the Hawker Hart, formed the major part of Sweden's bomber force from 1937 to 1942. Although obsolete even when the first Swedish-built B-4 rolled off the production line, it continued to serve throughout the Second War. Easy to fly and very reliable, Swedish pilots became masters of pinpoint bombing. By 1937, Sweden's aircraft production was rapidly expanding. ASJA was soon joined by a new company, backed by the government and Bofors. It was to be known as Svenska Aeroplan AB, or SAAB. Both companies began new plants at Trollhättan and Linköping. From the beginning, the government recognized the need for a joint cooperative effort, and a separate body was established to oversee production. Sweden's aircraft industry often hung on the diplomacy of men like Gunnar Delner, SAAB's first president. By the late 30s, the Air Force had recognized its critical need for a heavy bomber, and as a result, SAAB's first product was to be the German-designed Junkers Ju-86. A license had been purchased in 1937, and German technicians supervised all the early stages of production of this twin-engine bomber. However, by 1938, the production was solely in Swedish hands. Although not obsolete in 1937, it was the result of proven but outdated technology, and the Luftwaffe phased them out in 1939, the same year as the first Swedish-built Ju-86 took to the air. As the new aircraft began to roll off the production line, a new generation of men had to be trained to fly and service them. Ever since its inception, the Swedish Air Force's greatest enemy had been the weather. Temperatures in the north often reached minus 40 degrees Celsius, well below the freezing point of petrol and oil. Engines had oil stoves and insulated jackets. After each flight, the oil was drained and kept heated overnight. In conditions that would have grounded most other air forces, the Swedes remained operational. In 1938, the Air Force had re-equipped its training squadrons with the US-built NA-16. Fitted with skis to allow it to operate from frozen runways and lakes, the NA-16 became a firm favorite with cadets, not least because of its heated cabin. On September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Europe was plunged into war. In the following months, belligerent and neutral countries alike were attacked and occupied. The Swedish Air Force demanded more aircraft, but competition between the two companies had led to mismanagement and delays. In 1939, with invasion imminent, the government took a momentous step and merged the two companies. The resulting organization was known simply as SAAB. But the crisis in Sweden was only just beginning.
we were limited in our possibility to import aircraft from abroad. We were stopped by the Americans, by the Republic fighter aircraft, for example. And then we were quite aware of the importance of an own individual aircraft industry.
With overseas supplies restricted, SAAB threw all its efforts into a project that dated back to the mid-1930s. Developed in collaboration with a group of US engineers and designers, the SAAB 17 was to be a high-performance mid-wing monoplane. At the beginning of 1940, the US workers were withdrawn, and SAAB's design team were left to complete the project. The first prototype was constructed in the spring in record time. Every effort had been made to create a design that would be easy to mass produce, so that deployment could take place as soon as possible. On the 18th of May 1940, the S-17 was wheeled out for its first test flight. After initial teething troubles produced by the speed of the design program, the S-17 proved to be a great success, and mass production was ordered to start at once. Built in both reconnaissance and bomber versions, the S-17 was equipped with a unique retractable undercarriage that could, in the space of a few minutes, be converted from wheels to skis, enabling deployment no matter what the ground conditions. The brief lull after the fall of France came to a sudden end in April 1940, when Germany invaded Norway. Despite spirited resistance, the outdated Norwegian Air Force was shot out of the skies, and Norway fell in a matter of weeks. Although re-equipping as fast as possible, the Swedish Air Force was extremely vulnerable. During the invasion of Norway, it could put only one fighter squadron into the air. Flying outdated Gloucester Gladiators, it was hardly a match for the Me-109s of the Luftwaffe. But the Swedes used their limited resources to maximum effect, dispersing their aircraft in woods and fields to avoid ground attack, and using the Gladiators' high rate of climb from makeshift airstrips to surprise intruders. As the war progressed, the Air Force became better prepared. A large fighter base was built at Gothenburg on the west coast. Extensive underground facilities were constructed, and for the first time, intercept missions were coordinated from a central point. Safe from attack in underground hangars, aircraft could be serviced and rearmed. These J-11 fighters are actually imported Fiat CR-42s, which served in frontline service throughout the war. Of all the stopgap aircraft purchased by the government, the American-built Republic E-1 was the most modern. It was intended to form the backbone of the Swedish fighter force, but although 300 were ordered, only 60 were delivered. The rest were confiscated for the US war effort. With a long and vulnerable coastline to defend, a strong maritime force was essential. The Heinkel E-115A served in the naval reconnaissance and escort role for 10 years from 1939. It represented the last of a long line of Heinkel floatplanes that had done faithful service since the early 1920s. As Sweden's Air Force grew in strength, a series of large exercises were ordered. These mock battles served two vital purposes. They gave aircrew vital battle experience, essential for an air force that had never been to war. And they also served as a deterrent, showing outside aggressors that any invasion would be extremely costly. The policy of mass dispersal was now firmly in place. Bomber squadrons could be completely hidden in the dense forests, taking off from fields or open ground that needed little or no preparation, making it almost impossible for an enemy to destroy them on the ground. The heavy B-3, however, needed more permanent facilities, and to avoid the possibility of being surprised on the ground, air crew had to be able to scramble in under 2 minutes. In the event of real invasion, the bomber force would mass from many different points and attempt to deal a knockout blow to any seaborne or land attack. The effectiveness of the Swedish response to any attack can never be known. But by the second year of the war, the quality of its air force and aircraft industry made the defense of neutrality seem to be an achievable goal. With the prospect of attack from both Germany and Russia, Sweden's fighter force was kept on constant alert. Although a neutral power, Sweden had the right to intercept and attack any aircraft violating its airspace. From 1940 to 1945, 126 German aircraft were intercepted and either forced down or destroyed. Despite intensive diplomatic pressure, Sweden never allowed German aircraft to overfly the country. Any incursion was treated as a hostile act. However, not all damaged aircraft were pursued to destruction, as a recoverable machine provided invaluable information on the state of German aviation technology. Towards the end of the war, many German pilots, defecting from the Russian front, landed in Sweden. Many of these aircraft, like the Focke-Wulf Condor and the Ju-52, were converted and put to civilian use after the war. So many Friesler Storches landed in Sweden during the war that the Air Force was able to equip a whole training squadron in 1946. For Allied aircraft damaged in bombing raids over Germany, Sweden was the nearest safe haven. During the war, 141 US and 63 British planes landed safely in Sweden. On arrival, the planes were impounded and either stripped down or converted to military and civilian use. In 1943, the first Swedish-designed high-performance fighter was introduced. Strongly influenced by the best of German and Allied technology, the J29 was a great success. The power plant proved to be the only problem. Orders had been placed with Pratt & Whitney, but because of the war, only one engine was ever delivered. Without blueprints, SAAB's engineers copied the engine, eventually producing a higher performance than the original. By concentrating on a powerful fighter force, air chiefs had neglected the need for a bomber. It was to remedy this that in 1942, the first prototype of a new twin-engined strike aircraft was completed. Designed to replace the aging Ju-86, the B-18 was the first SAAB aircraft to be developed by a purely Swedish design team. With a cruising speed of 370 miles per hour, it could match any combat aircraft in its class. Flown for the first time in 1943, 242 were eventually built, serving with the Air Force until 1959. SAAB's chief designer, Frid Wanström, began work on a new and radical project.
This is the first pure SAAB fighter that was built in Sweden and used in the Swedish Air Force in the end of the 40s. It has, as you see, a pushing propeller, and therefore it has to be constructed with an ejection seat, and it was, as a matter of fact, the first ejection seat in the world. And this gave the advantage of having a free field for a free sight ahead, and you can arrange your weapons in a very good way. It was very accurate in that sense.
But as Wanström recalled in his memoirs, the first flight was far from successful. After some simple taxiing tests, the pilot opened up the throttle. However, as the plane came down the runway, it refused to lift. It continued on its run and only lifted at the last moment, smashing its undercarriage on a fence. The problem was simple to rectify. The brakes had been left on. In the end, the pilot belly landed without injury. Out of all the problems encountered on the J29, the ejector seat proved to be the most complex. Tests to determine the stress on the human body were encouraging, and these led to successful ground trials in 1944. Since that time, the ejector seat has become a standard fitting on all the world's combat aircraft and has saved countless lives. The end of the war in Europe marked a crossroads in Swedish aviation. The dilemma was simple. The overseas arms market was flooded with excellent and cheap combat aircraft. SAAB could not hope to compete when in 1946 the Air Force purchased 90 P-51 Mustangs for only $3,000 each. Another low-cost import was the de Havilland Mosquito, employed as a night fighter until the early 50s. The end of the Second War marked the beginning of the jet age, and Sweden's Air Force was soon demanding a high-performance fighter. SAAB had been working on the J-21R, a jet version of the J-21. But the J-21R was always a compromise, and after costly modification and poor performance, the project was cancelled. To fill the gap, the de Havilland Vampire was acquired from Britain, an ironic choice since the Vampire had been heavily influenced by SAAB's J-21. Over the next 5 years, 410 Vampires were purchased, forming the backbone of Sweden's combat force. To replace the aging Mosquitoes, which had already flown way beyond their intended endurance, the de Havilland Venom was purchased. The need for a high-performance night fighter was becoming ever more obvious as the tension between East and West intensified. The brief respite of the late 40s had ended, and once again the Air Force was put onto a war footing, ready to scramble, intercept, and destroy any unidentified aircraft. Luckily for the crew, this RAF Lancaster is identified before any damage is done. During its long service, the Venom became one of the most popular aircraft in the Swedish Air Force.
It was a very nice aircraft to fly, and we got the first one in 1953 and had it throughout the 50s in the Swedish Air Force. I remember one day when I was training with the night fighter exercise, the engine cut out suddenly, 9,000 meters altitude, and I flew in very bad weather, and together with my navigator, it was possible to fly more than 22 minutes, which I think is some sort of a world record, by gliding with a combat aircraft and landed happily after that with a lot of ice on and not very good view out and under rather difficult circumstances.
With its military projects limited to research and development, SAAB turned its attention to the commercial field and produced the Scania, a twin-engined short-haul airliner. Its first test flight in 1946 proved successful, and although it suffered from the lack of a pressurized cabin, the Scania was sold all over the world, eventually being license-built by the Dutch company, Fokker. But the fortunes of SAAB were soon to change. The early 1950s marked the height of the Cold War, and in 1951, an unarmed Swedish transport plane was shot out of the sky over the Baltic by Soviet fighters. Once again, pressure was placed on SAAB's design team to produce a high-performance fighter. In response, SAAB came up with the most advanced combat machine of its day, the J29 Tunnan. Based on German wartime data that US intelligence had discarded, the Swedes developed an advanced swept wing design with low drag and high maneuverability. My liveliest memory is of the building of the J29. We were in desperate need of aircraft in Sweden. The chief of the Air Force said that if we had 500 J29s, Sweden could stay out of a Third World War. We delivered one aeroplane a day, 250 in our first year. It was the biggest production we had ever taken on. It was a joyous time at SAAB to be building so many airplanes. The workshops really sang. The J29 soon replaced the Vampire as Sweden's main fighter aircraft. Deployed in heavily defended bunkers, the Air Force at last had the combat machine that could outperform both the Soviet MiG-15 and the US Sabre 86. Despite its cumbersome appearance, which earned it the nickname the Flying Barrel, the J29 had an excellent performance. The British test pilot, R.A. Moore, said of the aircraft, "On the ground it was like an ugly duckling, but in the air it performed like a swift." On the 6th of May 1954, Captain Anders Westerlund took off in an attempt to break the world speed record. His unmodified J29 reached 607 miles per hour, smashing the previous record held by the US. The J29's initiation into combat life was more a baptism of mud than of fire. In the mid-50s, a series of large-scale military maneuvers were ordered. The realistic nature of these exercises was paramount. No concessions were made to man or machine in an attempt to recreate combat conditions. As well as the world speed record, the J29 also earned the distinction as the only Swedish aircraft ever to go to war. Deployed with the United Nations forces in the Congo crisis of 1962, the small Swedish force attacked and destroyed the Tunnan Air Force in the space of a few minutes, without sustaining a single loss. In 1955, a number of Hawker Hunters were purchased to broaden the Air Force strength. But this was short-lived, as SAAB was already working on a new design. The original specification for a two-seat all-weather interceptor was given in 1948. The first prototype was constructed 3 years later, incorporating the by now proven swept-wing configuration. The SAAB 32, or Lansen, first flew on the 3rd of November 1952. 1 year later, it became the first Swedish aircraft to go through the sound barrier. Over the next 20 years, the Lansen formed the vanguard of Sweden's strike force.
We still use the Lansen, and we will do throughout the 90s as a special ECM training aircraft. It's a wonderful aircraft to fly, as many of the SAAB aircraft, and it's also beautiful to look at.
Flushed with the success of the Lansen, SAAB began to experiment with a revolutionary new design, the double delta wing. By combining the tail and wing control surfaces, drag was greatly reduced. Work began immediately on a small test plane known as the Mini Draken.
It was built in only one copy in order to test mainly the double delta wing construction that was the first double delta wing in the world. It was then followed by the full-scale J35 that was built in 604 copies totally and in 7 different versions.
The Draken design, which pioneered delta-wing aerodynamics, was a landmark in world aviation. Without the practical experience gained by the SAAB design, aircraft like Concorde would not have been possible. 6 years after the Lansen had reached Mach 1, the Draken exceeded Mach 2. The Draken remains in service today and is still being produced for the Austrian, Danish and Swedish air forces, a tribute to its highly sophisticated design. The Draken, along with Sweden's advanced radar systems, has been defending their vulnerable coastline for 30 years. The dream that had been inspired by the dark days of 1936 had become a reality. In the space of 10 years, Sweden had turned from one of the largest importers of aircraft to one of the biggest exporters. In an attempt to capture the jet trainer market, SAAB launched the 105. First flown in 1963, the 105 failed to sell abroad. However, large numbers were purchased by the Swedish Air Force, and 105s equipped their world-famous aerobatic flight. SAAB soon began work on another innovative project, the Viggen. The unconventional thin delta wing design with a small canard wing provided great maneuverability, minimal turbulence, and a low landing speed. But the design was expensive and untried. We always said that our task was to produce aeroplanes to suit Sweden's needs. That was what motivated the Swedish aviation industry, to design for Swedish conditions and not to buy from abroad. But the Viggen design was expensive, and the foreign deals were good. At this point, the whole project hung in the balance. In the end, it was the Viggen's superiority over foreign designs that saved it from cancellation. Its performance at low speeds and altitudes was remarkable, making it ideal for the high requirements of the Swedish Air Force. Today, the Viggen forms the central pin of Sweden's air defense policy, a policy built around the concept of flexible dispersal.
From one main base, we have several small bases around that base, which will make it difficult for an enemy to hit all these places, and we will always find, hopefully, one base to land on and one base to take off from. And they are connected in a road net system on ground, so we have a flexible system making service on ground, preparations and so on, and a flexible system from takeoff and landing point. I think this gives us a system which is to a very big extent better than to just build on one hardened airbase, which is more vulnerable, I think.
With the recent improvement in East-West relations, Sweden's international position seems secure. But the price for non-alignment and neutrality is constant vigilance. With the reduction in the size of the Air Force, increased pressure has been placed on man and machine. In wartime, combat aircraft are at a premium. On landing, a Viggen can be serviced, refueled and rearmed and be flying again in 8 minutes. In 1989, the Viggen is still being produced and has proven to be one of the most versatile combat aircraft in the world. Those who had fought through the financial difficulties of the 60s and the tempting offers of US and European aircraft manufacturers had finally been vindicated. In 1986, the Swedish Air Force celebrated 60 years of peaceful defense. The Lansen, Draken and Viggen, spanning 40 years of Swedish development, flew together for the first time. In the same year, SAAB unveiled its latest and most ambitious project, the Gripen, the most advanced combat aircraft design in the world. In December 1988, the Gripen is wheeled out for its maiden test flight. These are the first pictures ever shown of this revolutionary new prototype. The test pilot, Stig Hundström, receives the customary good luck kick before climbing in. Such is the level of investment on the Gripen that the future of SAAB and of the whole of Swedish aviation rests on this flight. The fundamentals of a test flight are still very basic, as Stig Hundström explains. From a standing start, I'll accelerate to about 250 kilometers per hour. Then I'll gradually pull back the stick and hope like mad she comes up. After that, I'll put her into a slow climb, keeping the undercarriage down in case I need to make a forced landing. I'll climb to about 300 meters and try to get a feel for the aircraft. It's vital that the escort aircraft are in position to assist me in case of any malfunctions.
landning om 3 sekunder. 3, 2, 1, in. Sätterna går ut. Stället går upp.
The Gripen design is based on a similar concept to the Viggen, but the aircraft is considerably more maneuverable. Exact performance figures are not yet available, but the Gripen is expected to outperform the Tornado, the MiG-29 and the US-built F-16. Increased use of carbon fiber to reduce weight, coupled with advanced electronics and extremely short takeoff and landing ability, make the Gripen ideal for Sweden's defense needs. Modern computerized systems actually allow the aircraft to find its own faults, and like the Viggen, the Gripen can be repaired with the minimum of base facilities. For the design team, today is the culmination of 10 years of work. But watching from the control center, they can only wait and hope. Their fate rests in the air with the test pilot. After a couple of circuits, I'll bring her in. No sudden turns or victory rolls, just a slow, straight approach. My priority is to bring her down in one piece.
After a successful mission, the Gripen touches down, displaying its unique braking system. Since its first flight in December of 1988, and following extensive trials, the Gripen has more than proved itself. In December of 1996, the last aircraft of the first batch of 30 Gripens was delivered to the Swedish Air Force. Such is the confidence of the Swedish armed forces that even before delivery of the first batch, a further 110 were ordered, followed by yet another order for 64. In the latter part of the 90s, the Swedish Air Force decided to allocate the third Gripen squadron to the F-10 Air Force wing stationed at Ängelholm in the southern part of the country. Fully integrated with NATO requirements, the Gripen is the first and only fourth-generation multi-role fighter in service. Its export potential is such that British Aerospace and SAAB have embarked upon a program of adapting Gripens to customer needs and jointly marketing this well-proven fighter. It was the F-10 Air Force wing that operated the last Draken squadron, which would be phased out by the turn of the century. The Viggen, of which there were 329 built, is no longer produced, but is still operational, mostly with the Swedish Air Force. SAAB's production of civil aircraft is principally limited to the SAAB 2000, a twin turboprop regional transport, which first flew on the 26th of March 1992, and the 340, a joint SAAB-Fairchild project which first flew in January of 1983. The 340 also began its life primarily as a twin turboprop regional airliner, but has subsequently been modified as an airborne early warning platform for the Swedish Air Force. The first fully equipped aircraft made its maiden flight at the beginning of July 1994. A search and rescue version has also been produced. But its impressive history of fighter production is what will be best remembered. Remembered not only for their outstanding performance, but for the fact that they have been produced by a country that has effectively stayed neutral for decades. To Sweden, aviation has always meant more than simply aircraft. It has meant peace and security. Perhaps it is this realization that has led to this small nation having one of the most advanced aviation industries in the world. The high technology of the Gripen stands in stark contrast to Baron Carl Cederström and his Blériot. To dream, to dare, to win. That was the motto of Sweden's first aviation pioneer, Carl Cederström.